So if you got your books, turn to page 187, and we will go through this. I did have a question beforehand that we're going to answer really quick. What is the difference between karma and you reap what you sow? Anybody thought about that before? So what's the difference between karma, that you do one thing and what kind of you get it back to you, or you reap what you sow? Because even if you look in the Old Testament, the New Testament, have you ever noticed that sometimes God says, like, I'll give you a verse. Obadiah chapter 1 verse 15 says, "For the day of the Lord is coming upon the nations. For what you have done, it will be done upon your head." Now that sounds a whole lot like what? Karma, right? The difference is this. Does the Bible say that every bad deed we will be repaid for? No. Does it say that every good deed we will be repaid for? No. But in karma, it is every single thing, good or bad, you will be repaid for. So everything, and there's sort of this mystic kind of force kind of thing that's putting all this stuff together. The cross is what makes karma what falls short, and reaping what you sow, and what karma does, because karma is going to say that every action you're going to get it, and I say, praise God, that I don't get every bad deed that I've done back on me. The same thing with good deeds. So that's sort of how these two things mold together. When we look at the religion of Islam, though, Islam is, I'll say this, most Americans are dangerously aware of Islam. And what I mean by that is when September 11th happened, everybody became an expert, supposedly, on Islam. And while there are many Muslims that would believe in jihad and in a holy war kind of mentality, that is not what every Muslim believes, but that is, you normally don't see Muslims on the news for, doing charitable acts. You just don't see it. We only hear about Muslims on the news when they're blowing up someone or someone has kidnapped someone. And unfortunately, that's what Muslims are known for, and we're going to see why that is and today. And really, when it comes down to it, Islam is it's called the religion of submission, and we're going to explain why that is in a little bit. But Islam is no bones about it. It is a religion of works. You want to get to heaven, you need to do more good deeds than bad. And in fact, it is viewed as a scale. That is sort of the picture of Islam. And when I have spent time in West Africa and talked with Muslims, I'll talk about that scale. And they're going to say at the end of your life, Allah is going to weigh your good stuff versus your bad stuff. And whichever way the scale is tipping is where you'll go to heaven or hell. Now, there are some ways around that, and we'll get into that as well. But let's go through this. If we turn to page 188, the outline, so much of what Islam is based around the life of Muhammad, which is believed to be the final prophet of Islam. Just so you know this, and we'll see in a little bit, Islam will say that Adam, Abraham, Moses, David, even Jesus are prophets of Islam. All of these people are prophets of Islam, and what happened, though, is that the Jewish people and the Christians messed up what Allah was trying to do, and so therefore Muhammad set them straight. So when you look at a lot of these things, you're going to notice that there is a huge, huge description as far as how these three religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, all sort of hit this fork in the road. But Islam, Muhammad's belief is that Judaism and Christianity messed up what God would actually reveal, and so it was his job to fix it. And so obviously that's going to come into some difficulties and with these three religions. So let's look at the life of Muhammad. As we look at the first slide here, we'll go this in sections. Revelations. Muhammad claimed to receive revelations from Allah from the angel Gabriel. Muhammad claimed to receive revelations from Allah from the angel Gabriel. Now, just so you know, Allah would be the Arabic way to say God, okay? So, in many ways, an Arabic Christian could say Allah and be talking about our God and be speaking in that way. So, Allah is not like a different name, so to speak, as much as it's the Arabic word for it. Muhammad was born in 570 A.D. The idolatrous city of Mecca was the home of Kaaba, an ancient shrine associated with Abraham. So Muhammad was born around Mecca, and there's this, the Kaaba is now, today it's a lot bigger, it's this gigantic box, and they built this sort of coliseum around where people will come, and if you're going to make your pilgrimage to Mecca, you're going to come visit, and they believe that Abraham and Ishmael once worshiped there, and so that's sort of the centerpiece of their religion. His parents died at an early age, and he was raised by an uncle. At 24, he married a wealthy widow and became a prosperous merchant. And at age 40, he felt that Allah was calling him to proclaim the word of God. In 610, the angel Gabriel gave him a vision from God. Okay? In 610, the angel Gabriel gave him a vision from God. He could not read or write, so he would recite the message to his wife and cousin, and they would write the messages down. So here's what happened. Muhammad would go off into a cave to go meditate. During that time, as he's meditating, he claims to have a vision that Gabriel comes down and says, I want you to be Allah's prophet. And you'll be able to read this in your readings for the homework for this coming week. But what happened originally was that Muhammad refused Gabriel's call. Gabriel said, Muhammad, I want you to be Allah's prophet. And Muhammad said, no. And you know what Gabriel did? Does anybody know the story? It's in the Quran. He began to choke Muhammad. Just choke him and choke him and choke him until finally, Muhammad tapped out and said, okay, I submit. I submit, and therefore Islam was born, which literally means submission. And so he joined up and decided to be the prophet because Gabriel, the angel, was choking the life out of him, and he eventually said, okay, I'll give up and I'll do this. So that's how he does it. And so he comes back and he tells his wife and his cousin, who is sitting there at the house, and he'd come back and he'd say, hey, I had this vision, write this down. Because obviously he can't read or write. So he's hearing these messages after Gabriel has choked him and shares this kind of stuff, and then he goes and tells his wife, his cousin, he writes them down. But at this point, he's not really telling anybody else about them. Just sort of keeps them between the three of them. In his early teachings, after a couple of years, he began to tell these messages to people outside of his family. After a couple of years, he began to tell these messages to people outside of his family. Historians believe he did not think he was starting a new religion, but continuing the line of Judaism and Christianity. Historians believe he did not think he was starting a new religion, but continuing the line of Judaism and Christianity. Let me show you this. In early thinking, Jews and Christians did not need to be converted. Okay, so this next passage is going to be from the Quran. Let me read it from you. Do not argue with the followers of, what is that word there? Earlier revelation. Otherwise, than in a most kindly manner. We believe in that which has been bestowed from on high upon us, as well as that which has been bestowed upon you. For our God and your God is one, and the same, and it is unto him that we surrender ourselves. So here's the deal, and that's in Quran chapter 29. Just so you know this, the Quran has 150 chapters. Here's the problem. It sort of follows in suit where the Bible is. It's not in chronological order, okay? The first chapter is the longest chapter, and the 150th chapter is the shortest chapter. The problem is this, that there are, and Muslim scholars will even say this, there are major contradictions within the Quran. In 150 chapters, major contradictions. Because as we're going to see in a little bit, we're also going to read another passage where Muhammad says, hey, if the Jews and Christians do not convert to Islam, you lie in ambush and you kill them if they don't convert. Now, does that seem like it'd be a problem compared to what we just read? It's a major problem. So the problem comes for Muslims today is this. They're going to talk about progressive revelation, that God would eventually give Muhammad more and more understanding as time went on. And so the later revelation is better than the earlier revelation. The only problem is what? We don't know which one came first and which one came last. So many Muslims are sitting here thinking, so are we all like in the family with Jews and Christians, or are we supposed to kill them if they don't convert? Like, which one's the later revelation? And so you see where some of the rub comes with a lot of even Muslims as they look at it. So originally, they did not see this as a different religion. He just thought, you know what? Some Jews sort of messed up what Allah was trying to do. Some Christians messed up what Allah is trying to do. I'm here to tweak this and make this right. It's my job to fix all this. And so that was sort of the idea. Letter D, it says when he started prayers, they were initially directed towards Jerusalem. Okay? So when he started having prayers, they were initially directed towards Jerusalem, which shows that he believed what? We're in this with Judaism and Christianity because that's the most holiest of cities for both of those religions. So when he started collecting followers, they all started praying towards the direction of Jerusalem, and because, well, that's the most holiest of cities, and that's where all this has started from. He just saw this as we're just continuing on this tradition. But this changed. Letter B, persecutions is the next heading. His unpopular teaching caused people to persecute him and his followers. Persecutions. His unpopular teaching caused people to persecute him and his followers. The focus of his earlier teachings was the injustice by the wealthy members of his society. Naturally, he attracted poor and disenfranchised people. He attracted poor and disenfranchised people. So what the problem here is, as he starts going along, so much of he's speaking out against that the rich were ruling over the poor and they were forgetting about the poor, and so he starts preaching this message. So who loves them? Poor people do. Who hates them? The rich people do. And that's what's going to cause a little bit of a problem. So in 616, Mecca began a persecution towards Muhammad and his followers. Now, when I say persecution, this really, from what historians will say, did not turn physical as much as it was, okay, wealthy people, don't do business with anybody that follows Muhammad. Don't do business with Muhammad. Stay away from him. So if Muhammad wants to get crops or whatever he might need, nobody's willing to do business with him. And so in some ways, it probably was a little bit worse than some physical persecution they could have experienced because their families are having a hard time surviving in that area, in the city of Mecca. So in 622, a few families followed Muhammad to Medina, which is 250 miles to the north, due to the opposition. Now you see this here on our map as we have this. You see where Mecca is in that large city right there in Saudi Arabia. Up to the north is Medina. And also, look even further up to the left, you see Israel, where Jerusalem is going to be. So if you've ever wondered why you always feel like you turn on the news and somebody's bombing somebody in this area, this is why. Because Judaism, Christianity, and Islam just have some deep, deep roots here, and they all sort of say that we're from the same family, but very disagree sharply on what happens, and things have obviously moved from there. So, because of the persecution, Muhammad and his followers move up to Medina. At this time, number 4, Muhammad lived near a Jewish clan who exposed him to the Old Testament teaching. At this time, Muhammad lived near a Jewish clan who exposed him to the Old Testament teaching. So here's what happened as you're turning the page. So as he moves to Medina, he just so happens to be next door neighbors to a Jewish clan. And not knowing exactly how all this worked out, but in my mind and what I've read, it appears that the Jewish clan and him were somewhat friendly. You got to understand right now in this time in Saudi Arabia and in this area, where Muhammad lived, there really wasn't a unifying factor with all the people. Okay? Like, there's Rome, and it sort of become Christianized at this place, and there's a big empire, and there's an emperor, and there's all these kind of stuff, and you go to other countries, and there's kings, and there's kind of stuff. In Arabia at this time, it was just clans and tribes, really. There was no unifying factor. Everybody just sort of does their own thing. There wasn't a lot of unification. There wasn't a lot of alliance. And so in this middle, here's this Jewish clan who meets this guy who's illiterate, and they just befriend him. And they start saying, hey, we're Jewish. And then he's like, okay, that's cool. And they just, I don't know if they're being evangelistic or if he's asking them questions, but he starts sharing them of stories which we would know from the Old Testament, but they're just going to think this is our biblical stories. So they start teaching him about creation. They start teaching him about Noah and the flood. They start teaching him about the fall. They start teaching him about Babel. They start teaching him about Abraham. And then they get to Abraham, and all of a sudden he hears something that he hasn't heard before. Hears that before there was Isaac, Abraham had another son named Ishmael. And he goes, whoa, who? He said, well, Ishmael is the name of the son. And that's when it comes in. So if you look at C really quick, the big sort of heading here is modifications. Modifications. Upon receiving Jewish teaching, he began to modify the biblical story. And he hears that Abraham had another son, Ishmael, and he knows that he moved into the area which he lived. So, when Muhammad is learning this story about the Old Testament, and he hears that there's another son, and rumor is that Ishmael at some point came and sort of settled in the country of Arabia, what Muhammad starts thinking is this. So all of these disjointed clans and tribes of people, we all really come from one person, Ishmael, who actually is the firstborn of Abraham. Not Isaac. Isaac was the secondborn. 13 years later. I mean, in this kind of country, it's always the firstborn, right? And that's going to be the big part. And so he understands, he goes, well, Ishmael supposedly settled in this. Maybe we're all descendants of Ishmael, the firstborn of Abraham. So, number 2, I'm trying to look at this. He began to believe that the Arab people were of direct bloodline to Abraham. He began to believe that the Arab people were of direct bloodline to Abraham. Now, in your book, you see Abraham's family tree. This is the abbreviated version. And we've talked about this a little bit, I believe, in this class. But you remember Abraham married to Sarah, right? They could not have children. Why? They old. Okay, it's not happening. So Sarah says, dear, I have an idea. Why don't you have sex with my servant named Hagar, which is just a lovely name. Abraham and Hagar are able to have a son named Ishmael. And then all of a sudden, God looks at Abraham and says, hey, thanks for trying to help me out, but I don't need your help. I'm God. I can make any womb produce a child if I want to. So you're going to have a child. And in fact, you're going to name him what? Isaac, because it means what? Laughter. So every time you call that boy's name, I want you to remember it. You laughed at me. So when he's kicking you in the shin, and when he's knocking stuff over in your house, and when he's getting in all kinds of trouble, and you call out, you're saying laughter. I laughed. He wasn't even going to be here. Every time you say his name, it's going to be a reminder. You laughed at this promise. So 13 years later, after Ishmael is born, 13 years now, Isaac is born to Abraham. Interesting enough that in Genesis chapter 22, when Abraham comes to sacrifice Isaac, God says, I want you to take your son, your only son, up on the mountain. That's interesting phrasing, isn't it? Because we all know there's another son. And in fact, God throughout the book of Genesis says, take care of that son, provide for that son, provide for Hagar. But in this moment, he's saying, no, I'm not going to be talking about the child of the works, okay? I'm going to be talking about the child of the promise. Think about it. If you think about Ishmael, that was the child of what man can do. Following me? Isaac was the child of what who could do? God. And think about, okay, when you look down this family tree, you're going to notice a couple of things and you see this, but think about that. So Ishmael comes from works. This is what man can do. And guess what's going to happen? A religion is going to form from that named Islam, which is all about this. What can man do to get to God? And then on the other side, we've got Jesus, who's going to come from here, is about a miraculous birth yet again, whom only God can get the credit for. So you see these different? So if you look at Abraham's family tree, Abraham has and Sarah have Isaac. Isaac has Jacob, whose name turns into what? Israel. And he has 12 sons who are the 12 tribes of Israel, and many generations down, and we have the name of who? Jesus. And if you look down over to Abraham and Hagar, they have Ishmael, and many generations later, Muhammad says, so I'm a direct bloodline to the firstborn of Abraham, the father of monotheism, the father of this, that we're actually bloodline to the firstborn. And so therefore we have the right to say, you Jews and you Christians, you've got all this messed up, but we're going to come fix it. And so what Muhammad does in this moment is, he goes, I think I figured out what all the issues are. So number 3, Jews and Christians didn't like his different portrayals of Hebrew figures. Well, you can understand that, right? So just imagine, for any of you that have ever taught children or students or anybody the Bible, and if you're like me, you love those times when you're teaching a child a Bible story they've never heard before, and they go, oh, that happened. You know, just the amazement and the wonder of it all, like, no way, like, yeah, that happened. And they're just like, really? And then what happened? I forgot what it was the other day that the boys were just flipping out about. I was telling them something, and they just thought it was the funniest, craziest thing. They're like, that's in the Bible? And when I turned, they're like, it's really in there. I'm like, I'm not making this up. And they're just like, it's blowing them away. And can you imagine that in this moment, as I'm teaching them this Bible story, they look at me and go, Dad, I don't think that's the way it happened. In fact, I think it probably happened like this. It actually wasn't that person, it was that person. And instead what happened, when you said that, it actually happened this way. And all of us parents would say, you're ridiculous. This has been around hundreds of years. This is the first time you've ever heard it. How dare you try to reinvent the story? And guess what? That's what Muhammad did. It turns into this. In the Garden of Eden, when you read the Quran, you're going to read sections of it and you're going to be like, oh, that sounds like the Bible. No harm, no foul. And then all of a sudden, you're going to be in the Garden of Eden, and instead of God casting out Adam and Eve, guess who cast them out? Satan does. Minor detail, right? Major one. Who has the authority to kick somebody out of paradise? Only God. But Muhammad said, no, I think it was probably Satan that did that, in fact. Guess who Abraham almost sacrificed on that altar that day? Ishmael. Wasn't Isaac. The Jews messed up that story. I'm here to fix it. So he starts looking at this Old Testament clan who's teaching them all these stories. He's hearing most of them for the first time. He's heard of Abraham. He's heard of Isaac. He's heard of Ishmael. But they're sitting down and they're opening up the scriptures and they're reading it to him. And he turns and says, I don't think that's the way it happened. What do you think? They liked him too much? Nah, not exactly. They got very fired up and very upset, and there's probably some heated dialogue. So here's the shift that happens, okay? By 624, he had developed a large following in this area. There's a lot of people are starting to follow Muhammad, and he's starting to align a lot of people. One day, he told his followers to stop praying towards Jerusalem and begin to pray towards Mecca. And the shift begins to happen. This action revealed he no longer saw Islam as an extension of another religion, but they were their own people, and Mecca was the holiest of cities. Now, why would Mecca be the holiest of cities? A couple reasons. Because the Kaaba was there, this shrine that supposedly Abraham and Ishmael had worshipped at. And number two, that's where Muhammad's from. And this shift takes place. No longer Jerusalem. So one day, can you just imagine all the followers, they get down, and if you've ever been in an area where Muslims will bow down and they know what direction they need to sort of focus their prayers to, wherever they are in the world, to focus towards Mecca. Can you imagine? And if you look at the map, it's not going to be that huge of a shift necessarily, but for them it was, because if you think about it, basically they used to pray north from Medina, right? They'd all, go and they start praying north, and everybody's like, okay, it's time for our salas, it's time for our prayers, and they all go, and Muhammad goes, stop. We're not going to pray north this time. We're going to pray south. Why are we praying south? Because Mecca is the holiest of cities. And you see this, now he doesn't see himself as an extension of Judaism or Christianity. He sees this as something completely different. And this shift begins to happen. And you'll start seeing the shifts happen in the Quran. You just don't know exactly which came first necessarily. And so which leads us to these confrontations that happen. First battle. Medina was known for farming, and since Muhammad and his followers didn't know how to farm, they raided caravans. They raided caravans traveling to and from Mecca. Medina was known for farming. Since Muhammad and his followers didn't know how to farm, they raided caravans traveling to and from Mecca. So once again, Muhammad was a merchant, and he moved into a farming community. And so to get food for him and his people, and as they continue to get large, they've got to figure out a way. And there's sort of like a sport back in the day. It's called raiding. And it wasn't necessarily, it wasn't like good, but it wasn't like, it sounds really, it is stealing, but it was an art form kind of deal. And as long as you didn't get caught, or as long as you didn't injure anybody, it sort of was fair game. And so Muhammad was a really good strategist. So he would get his people, and so as the caravans coming from Mecca and selling goods in different cities, Muhammad and his followers would be lying in wait somewhere. They'd steal all the food off the caravan. They'd run off. Nobody get hurt. But after a while, this started getting on Mecca's nerves, okay, because they're losing money. And so what happens is Mecca hired an army to get rid of him. He was causing too much disruption, stealing too much. And in 627, a 10,000-member army marched against Muhammad's 3,000-member army. Okay? In 627, a 10,000-member army marched against Muhammad's 3,000-member army. So who's probably going to win this battle? You would think would be Mecca or Muhammad. Mecca or Muhammad. It would be Mecca, most likely. That's what we all would think. But actually, Muhammad prevailed at the Battle of the Trench, is what that's called. Muhammad prevailed at the Battle of the Trench. It's called the Battle of the Trench because he used the trench that was in the city of Medina. And as they came, they were sort of trapping these guys in here. And those 3,000-member army defeated the 10,000-member army and was pretty impressed by his strength. And so this seemed like it was going to be just an easy kind of snuff out kind of deal. Yet Muhammad proved to be a pretty smart tactician when it came to army and warfare. And so they defeated this 10,000-member army from Mecca. During this time of this battle, Muhammad learned that 3 tribes of Jews were conspiring with Mecca against him. So during this battle, he figures out that the reason why this 10,000-member army is marching upon them is because his Jewish friends who had taught him the word got a little frustrated that he kept changing that word. And so they basically said, hey, how can we get him? And the Jewish clan says, well, you could do this or possibly you could do that. And they come along and try to help him out. So he forced 2 tribes to leave the area. The 3rd tribe, he killed 700 to 900 men and sold or enslaved all the women and children. So with these 3 Jewish clans that are around them, they conspire with Mecca to get him out. And he makes 2 of the tribes leave their home. And the 3rd one, he kills about 700 to 900 men and sold or enslaved all the women or children. So right up to this point, you starting to see how Islam's religion is tied into its history of being this religion and also being this militant group. You already see it. This is the very beginnings of it. I mean, he's raiding caravans. He's settling armies. He's paying back those for insurrection. I mean, there is a definite militant heartbeat to this thing early on. And, gosh, I'd be upset if I heard that my Jewish neighbors had conspired to kill me too. But you see what's happening here is just building. You feel it escalating and escalating. So here's the second battle. In 630, Mecca put together another army. But instead of waiting for them, letter B is this: Muhammad took the battle to them and they surrendered. Basically, he hears that another army is coming up against him, and he's like, I'm not waiting for him. And they just march on Mecca. When he gets to Mecca, they basically hand over the keys of the city to him, like, here, you take over. Because once again, there's not this kind of authoritative leader. There's not this really rallying government. It's just really just all over the place. And here he comes marching with this big army. And his reputation now is a little bit fearful in the area because they're going, oh, who is this Muhammad? I mean, 3,000 men defeated 10,000. They're just scared of him. So by the time he marches, they just go, we give your city. What do you want to do? We surrender. And so as this continues to escalate, here is about his death. In 632, he became ill and died. Whenever I tell that, it seems so just like 2 years later, you just got the city, you just won, you're in charge now, and then he died. He didn't die because he was persecuted or killed or anything like this. They just believe he had a common sickness, and he died in the arms of one of his wives at this time. And I did say one of his wives. He had a bunch towards the end of it. Most people believe that he died in the arms of his first wife. She's really old at this point. But that he died in her arms. So after his death, a division arose as to who would lead. Okay, so after his death, the division arose to who would lead. And let's look at these two real quick. The Shiites thought it should be a member of Muhammad's bloodline, focusing on a religious leader. The Shiite Muslims thought it should be a member of Muhammad's bloodline, focusing on a religious leader. And the Sunnis, y'all have heard these phrases before, the Shiites and Sunnis. Here's where they started. Sunnis thought it should be an elected political military leader. So after his death, everybody's trying to figure out, well, who's going to lead? And so the Shiite Muslims thought it should be a member of Muhammad's family. Let's find the next of kin. Let's find this. It was as far as who should be that, to be a religious leader. And these Sunnis were like, no. Let's keep this sort of political, military kind of strategist kind of area going. And so some of those, that separation that happened back then still sort of occurs today when you hear the Sunni Muslims or the Shiite Muslims. And so there's the differences where they started. And so once again, if you look at Muhammad's life, you see how his life, you already see some of the stuff that you hear about Islam, how it's really intricate, woven through this. That there is this separation between those that are peaceful and those that are very wanting to kill people. And there are those people that are it's a religion of peace, and this is a militant kind of, lording over group. And so what you see in Muhammad's life really is played out in the last 1,400 years in what Islam's nature has been. And a lot of people will talk, and I'll throw this out, you'll see a story like this and you go, how in the world can Islam even claim to be a peaceful religion? I mean, look at its origins, look at what some of the people in the name of Islam have done. And I would also remind us that we have some stuff in our past that's not too pretty to look at either. There are some people that in the name of crusades were going and killing and doing stuff like that. And so we can't just say, oh, they're violent, so therefore they're out of being a peaceful religion, because therefore we're out too. But what comes down into Islam, which is just so unique, is how some of the teachings are going to be so confusing as to exactly how we're supposed to to do this. So let's look at the Quran for a minute. The Quran is Islam's holy book. Once again, Quran means a recitation. They was going to recite this words to Gabriel, recited it to him. He goes and recites it to his wife and his cousin. His followers committed his revelations to memory and wrote them down before his death. It contains 114 chapters. I said 150 earlier. I'm sorry, I was thinking Book of Psalms. It contains 114 chapters. The book is not in chronological order. And the Quran includes contradictory statements. Underline that, contradictory. And historians claim Muhammad received progressive revelation. And underline that word, progressive revelation. So here's what progressive revelation meant. The first time that Gabriel comes to Muhammad, he's going to progress in the teaching and the information that he gives to Muhammad. He's not just going to throw it all out at once, because Muhammad's not spiritually or mentally ready to see the whole big picture. So Gabriel holds a little something back. So first off, he goes, I just want you to be Allah's prophet. He's calling you to be his prophet. And Muhammad says, nope, can't do that. So Gabriel just chokes him to the point. He taps out, goes, okay, I'll do it. He goes, okay, next time I'll come back and I'll give you a little more. Okay. And so then the belief is this: how do you know which one came first, which one came later? So when you look at these different contradictory statements, and a lot of this has to do with warfare and how you see other religions, the Quran is very, you don't know exactly which comes later. Honestly, if you look at it in some ways, it really doesn't matter. When I say that, because the heartbeat of Islam is it's going to be a religion of submission, and it's going to be a religion of works. You do enough good stuff and maybe you'll go to heaven. That's regardless of how you read it, that's going to be in there. Well, the difference is how Muslims are going to apply certain texts. Are we on the same family with Jews and Christians, or are we completely at different place? And so that's these progressive revelations. The reason this is how Muslim scholars will argue. If you find somebody go, yeah, but aren't there contradictory statements? No educated Muslim is going to say, no, there's no contradictory statements. If they've read the Quran, they go, yeah, we know. But here's how it works. Progressive revelation. Allah would say at one time, hey, we're all on the same team, because he knew Muhammad didn't have his theology all correct yet. But once he had been further in his faith and his understanding, then God says, okay, I know I told you that back here, but now I want to tell you the rest of the story. Let me explain a little bit further. And so that's how they're going to define that, explain that, into how all those contradictory statements work together. Let's look at the 5 pillars. These are the 5 pillars of Islam. If you ever want to know, this is the summary of what Islam is, what they teach. If you want to get to heaven, here are the 5 pillars. Number 1 is confession. You must confess one's faith in Allah and in His Prophet Muhammad. Confession. Confess one's faith in Allah and in the Prophet Muhammad. So this is more like your statement of faith. This is like sort of a one-time kind of thing. Like, I believe Allah is the one true God, and Muhammad is His last and greatest prophet. That's sort of the thing that you would say or believe. That's sort of the entrance into this. So that confession that Allah is God and the last and greatest prophet of all of these prophets is Muhammad. And so once again, he thinks Adam is a prophet of Islam. He thinks that David is a prophet of Islam. He thinks that Jesus is a prophet of Islam. In fact, Islam is going to be the one that believes, they're going to speak out in the Quran about that there's no way that Jesus was God's son. How in the world could he be that? We know that certain people will say that Jesus is God's son, but God doesn't have a baby. God's never been with a woman. You know, that's how it's going to sort of be worded. And it's also going to say that Jesus never died upon the cross, but a lookalike was put in Jesus' place before he went to the cross, and Jesus was just taken up to heaven. And once again, that could not be more antithetical to what Christianity is. Jesus came to be the substitute, not to receive a substitute. So what Islam does is, here's this story, once again, 600 years after Christ has been crucified, and goes, no, I don't think that's how it happened. I think instead, Jesus was a great prophet and a great man. How could God allow him to do that? How could God allow a good and perfect prophet to do the work of salvation when we need to do the work of salvation? And so he takes Jesus off the cross and puts a look-alike on the cross in his place. And so Jesus is ascended into heaven, and therefore there is no substitutionary atonement. So therefore we got to do work. So obviously there's some issues there when you look at it. And this is where I just love having conversations with anybody who just says, we're all the same religions, we're all going the same path. And I'm like, really? How can all these things, I'm not saying which one's greater or better or right, but they all can't be right at the same time. They're saying completely different things. And so we've got to be respectful of that. One interesting book that I think I mentioned here, it's called God Is Not One, is written by Stephen Prothero, who's the guy that CNN and MSNBC and all these guys are going to use every time when they want a religion expert. He teaches in Boston. He's a professor, smart guy. Why I like Prothero is because even though why he says he's still religiously confused, he's the expert on religion, but he says he's religiously confused, doesn't know how all this stuff lines out. He will say this, he said it's offensive to say all religions are the same. And we need to stop with that nonsense because they're not. It's offensive to tell a Buddhist, well, actually, you're just a closet Christian, and when you get to heaven, you're going to find out it was always Jesus. It's offensive to them. And so, but when he looks at his book, he talks about that he orders them, the chapters in like cultural significance, I believe is how he words it. And you would think he would just look at the number of adherents. If you think of all the world religions, you'd think he starts with Christianity. Christianity is after another religion. The first religion is Islam. And he goes, I know that Christianity has more adherents than Islam, but when you want to talk about how a religion will change a culture and change the life of that adherent, you can look no further than Islam. Because when you sign up for Islam, it changes everything. And in Christianity, some people can sort of be halfway in and halfway out. Ouch is the word for that. Here's this guy saying, if you look at these religions, when you sign up to be Islam, it changes everything. And Christians, just sort of take it or make it whatever you want to do. It just sort of can be halfway in. You can be straddling the fence. And he says, if you look at significance, Islam's winning in the world, is what his and based on that definition, can we argue with that? I really can't. I think it's spot on that when you sign up to be a Muslim, everything changes. Now, are there bad ones? Sure, there are, but there's definitely much more. This is a way of life. So, confession, B is worship, or which there's 5 times of prayer a day directed towards Mecca. Sometimes they'll say worship, sometimes they'll say prayer. A good Muslim will pray 5 times a day. In Mecca, if you've ever seen anybody roll out a mat somewhere, for those who've been to West Africa, you've seen this a lot. There'll be a certain time of the day they're going to roll out the mat. They're going to sort of face that direction or wherever that direction is for them, and they are going to pray. So they'll bow down, they'll pray. Once again, 5 times throughout the day is an important thing. C is almsgiving, purification tax on property for the benefit of the poor. Almsgiving, so this is sort of the giving aspect of it, and this also goes back to his earlier wanting to take care of the poor. This sort of comes into that. So almsgiving is the 3rd pillar. D is fasting in the month of Ramadan. Fasting in the month of Ramadan. And Ramadan, Kara, help me out. End of June to end of July, right? Yeah. I think it's June 21st through July 21st is when. So for Islam, they have a different calendar kind of system, but Ramadan is a month for them, and they fast from sunup to sundown. But now when it's sundown, you can eat. So you can sort of make up for the day if you need to. Sunup to sundown, you're not supposed to eat. This has also come into play in recent years because in certain times when wars would happen with Islamic states or when terrorist groups, that there sort of used to be this kind of thing like, hey, don't mess with anybody during Ramadan because that's just not right. That's a religious thing until Muslim terrorists started to attack unsuspecting people during Ramadan, and it was sort of like this unwritten, or this probably was a written rule, like, hey, you can't go to war with a Muslim during that month. So literally there were times where like it sort of, they'd press pause and sort of sit out until one day some Islamic group said, hey, this would be good, we'll catch them by surprise. And so now sort of Ramadan is off from fighting time. They can fight during it. And then E is pilgrimage. Every able body is to travel to Mecca at least once in a lifetime. So you want to go see Mecca, you want to go see the Kaaba, you want to be able to pray at that centerpiece where supposedly Abraham and Ishmael had once worshipped and so many others have gone. Now, if you were too sick or too poor to go, there are some ways around it. You can go to a sort of checkpoint that's a little bit closer to where you are, or you can send somebody in your place and they can sort of go as like a representative, but you really only have to go once in your lifetime. But this is sort of like the holy trip. This is so whenever you hear like somebody taking the pilgrimage to Mecca, that's what they're talking about here. So it's this holy journey. You've got to go and visit that spot. Now, those are the 5 pillars of Islam. Like, that's what you're going after. That's what you want to see. Well, that's what you want to do. When you look at the scale of Islam on page 193, it says, then those whose balance is heavy, they will attain salvation. But those whose balance is light will be those who have lost their souls. In hell will they abide. So that is the deal. That is the scale they're talking about. If you keep these 5 pillars, like number 1 is confession, okay, the scale goes really, really high. And then all of a sudden you do bad stuff and it starts messing around. But if you do prayers, it's tipping over. If you give a lot of money, it's tipping over. If you make the pilgrimage, it tips way over. And so at the end of your life, it just really comes down to this, that God is going to sit as judge and say whether or not your scale tips this way or that way. And depending upon that, you'll go into heaven or hell. And then here's the guarantee of Islam. Those who have left their homes or been driven out therefrom or suffered harm in my cause or fought or been slain, verily, I will blot out from them their iniquities. A reward from the presence of God and from His presence is the best rewards. Did you catch what that's saying? That's why terrorist groups have the best fighters, right there in that verse. Because if your scale is tipping in this area to the negative, really, really bad, and you know it, one way to tip that scale in your favor is if you die in a holy war to crush the infidels, then all of a sudden the scale tips over. So if you know that you've been bad, if you've lived poorly, the best thing for you to do is to be a kamikaze pilot. Best thing for you to do is to get into a holy war and strap a bomb to your chest. That's the best option for you, because you know, and Allah knows, you are in big trouble unless you do something. And this is the only way you're going to tip that scale. You don't even have time to do that. So, which makes things very interesting. Obviously, everybody knows what happened to the pilots on September 11th, right? We know their schedule. We know their plans. There's been all kinds of documentation about that. But what's interesting about those pilots that flew into the plane on September 11th is most people, some people went back to see what those Muslim men were doing on September 10th. Many of you, some of you have seen this story or heard about this. On September 10th, what's very interesting is those little Muslim boys did stuff that little Muslims should never have done. They went to places they should never done. Were able to enjoy certain things they never should. Muslim little boys never supposed to do, and this is the reason why they did it. That scale was tipping, but they knew tomorrow. So they just lived it up. September 10th, they could do whatever they wanted to, because on the 11th, when they crashed that plane, they thought we were in a jihad, a holy war, and Allah is going to remove every one of those sins. So September 10th was the day to live it up. Now you talk about a dangerous belief in religion. I mean, honestly, if that were true, well, that's about your greatest option, right? Do whatever you want to do and just sort of hold this out here at the very end, and then you're going to. And that's why we wonder, like, well, it's just a small terrorist group. They don't even have that much information or money. How are they, causing such, a stir everywhere they go? That's why. Because they're willing to die for this, because they know it's going to absolve them from their sins, is the belief that they have. So when we look at these readings, we're going to look. I want you to look at page 194. There are some readings that I want you to do before we come next week. There's the call of Muhammad and different things through that. So if you'll just continue to go through these, once again, it's about probably 14 pages, I believe, of readings. I want you to do this before you come. And what we're going to do is we're going to watch one of these videos that's going to help us here, see this a little bit better. So do those readings before you come next week. And then we're going to look really at these 3 religions, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, and how they all fit together. A couple weeks ago, I let you guys see some videos from the Chicago Police Department. Weren't those helpful? They're really, really helpful. I've never seen anything as good as a summary as this. And so this is, I love the police chief. He's just funny to me, but the whole thing is really good. So we're going to look at Islam. There's actually 2 videos, 2 slides. I'll go back to back. Once we get to one, we'll just go to the next one. But we'll look at these 2 videos. It's about, once again, 10 minutes long, sort of help us get our eyes around it. And then after that is over with, once again, read these readings before we come, and then we'll go from there. So let's watch this together.
It is a religion of peace, submission, and commitment to one God and all He created. It is a way of being, a way of life. It is Islam, and fully 1/5 of people in the world follow this faith. They call themselves Muslims. Hello, I'm Chaplain Dean with the Chicago Police Department. This is the second in a series of videos to expand your knowledge and understanding of the many diverse communities within our city. Having even a basic knowledge of a person's customs and culture enables police officers to conduct their duties in a more efficient and respectful manner. Today, we explore Islam. The Chicago area is home to more than 400,000 Muslims. Many are immigrants from around the world, but many more are second or third or even fourth generation Americans.
For example, within the United States, the largest constituency of Muslims happen to be African American. After that, you have many Southeast Asians, Pakistanis, Indonesians, Malaysians, and then down there, then you have some, Arabs.
And there are Muslims of every stripe, of every color and nationality. There are white Americans who are Muslim, African Americans who are Muslim. There are Russians and Chinese and Japanese who are Muslim. It's very important to keep in mind that Islam is not an ethnicity. It is simply a very basic religious creed.
Muslims believe in one God who revealed Islam through all the prophets, with the final prophet being Muhammad.
Abraham is like the father of the three faiths, they call it. And the Christianity and the Judaism, it's all linked together. We're all of one God.
That is the very definition of Islam, is to submit oneself to the message of God.
We must stand for the protection of life. We stand for law against crime. We stand for morality and obedience to the law.
As human beings who are living in the society, we're very committed to the upliftment of this society. And that we see as definitely a religious obligation.
We bring a strong essence of moral values, family values, social values, notions of justice, notions about community service and social interaction, which are an inherent part of Islam, but which are also very important in the American fabric.
A Muslim place of worship is called a mosque. The imam is the person who leads the prayers. The Islamic holy book is called the Quran, and God is often referred to as Allah.
So the word Allah is nothing other than an Arabic word for God. In fact, many of the Christian population in the Middle Eastern areas, they refer to their God as Allah because it's just an Arabic term for God.
Muslims practice the 5 pillars of Islam. These are witness, affirming the absolute unity of God and accepting the prophecy of Muhammad; worship, offering ritual prayers 5 times a day to God while facing in the direction of the Kaaba in Mecca; charity, obligatory donation annually of at least 2.5% of accumulated wealth; fasting, complete abstinence from food, drink, and conjugal relations from dawn until dusk by able-bodied adults during Ramadan; pilgrimage, visiting the Kaaba and other sites in Mecca at least once in a lifetime. Muslims will conduct their daily prayers privately if possible, or publicly if necessary.
When a Muslim prays, he prostrates or she prostrates him or herself to the ground and puts their head to the ground. And again, it's not a prayer, unless you have seen this before or been around Muslims, that you're accustomed to seeing.
If law enforcement officials, if police officers have to contact some Muslims, it would be best to avoid those times when people are focusing on prayer, especially in public places.
Friday is the holiest day in Islam. Between 12 noon and 2, Muslims gather at mosques for congregational prayers.
Very, very sensitive, the Friday prayers. And the mosque is very, very sensitive. If you have to go in the mosque for a criminal, I beg you to have the same respect you would have for a Catholic church or for a Protestant church.
We don't wear our shoes. We don't wear our shoes onto the actual carpets and the prayer rugs. So that would be considered extremely inappropriate and offensive for example, police officers going in to investigate something or what have you, to walk on the rugs with their shoes. Of course, also there are copies of the Quran oftentimes that are kept in these mosques on bookshelves throughout the mosque area itself, it's considered extremely inappropriate to put that on the floor.
Islam attaches high significance to personal modesty and requires both men and women to dress in clothes that do not emphasize bodily contours. Women are also expected to cover their hair, and many, but not all, Muslim women wear the headscarf known as the hijab for this purpose.
The real purpose is just to notify yourself as somebody who believes in God. And it's really respect for God that you do this for. You have to cover in front of men who are unrelated to you. So I uncover at home, you know, in home environments with family. If I was with a group of women, I wouldn't have to cover.
Policemen should treat Muslim women with particular care and sensitivity about modesty and touching, regardless of whether the hijab is worn or not.
Muslim men and women are prohibited from being alone in a room with a person of the opposite sex with the door closed. So if it's necessary to interview somebody of the opposite sex, whether it's, you know, male to female or female to male, it would be preferable to have another person in the room.
Police will also find that many Muslim women and men will not shake hands and will avoid direct eye contact with members of the opposite sex.
And that may be misconstrued as disrespect, or a person is averting something, or anxious about something. But oftentimes what it is again the modesty that is prescribed as part of the way Muslims conduct themselves, whether they are men or women.
The headscarves and long skirts worn by some Muslim women lead to erroneous assumptions that Muslim women are somehow oppressed.
A lot of times people think that Muslim women haven't really had much experience, or are not allowed to do many things, and I think that it couldn't really be further from the truth.
Nothing holds me back as far as being a Muslim woman. I mean, once you really study Islam, if you're in university and take the classes, you'll see that Islam basically was the first women's liberation movement. It helped the poor. It helped the women from being oppressed.
They can own their own businesses, they can own their own property. They were given voting rights from the very beginning in the Islamic tradition.
And Muslim boys and girls are equally cherished and keep their parents equally busy.
Our children go to school. My daughter is a typical teenager. She's fascinated with basketball. She plays for the school team. Both my children are into tennis. They follow it very closely because that is one of my avid avocations aside from work and other community work.
Like Muslim women, Muslim men wear a variety of dress. Head coverings such as kufis, skull caps, or turbans are not religious requirements but cultural preferences.
For a man to remove his hat or that which is covering his head is much less of an issue in public than it is for a woman.
Many Muslim men also grow beards in deference to the Prophet Muhammad. Cultural dress does not necessarily mean the person is foreign. Assumptions based on a person's clothing should be avoided.
Muslims aren't necessarily from somewhere else. Just because a woman wears a headscarf doesn't mean she came off the boat from somewhere.
Because a lot of times people meet me and they think, oh, this is a foreigner, she doesn't know how to speak English, she's not educated, and then I turn out to be pretty normal.
Dr. Lena Shabandar was in fact born here and educated at Northwestern University. Muslims are valued members in all professions.
I was born in Jordan. I lived there for the first 10 years, and then I immigrated to the United States. And I've been living here for the last 23 years. I've been a policeman with the Chicago Police Department going on 6 years. My brother's a policeman. I have a lot of good friends who are police officers that speak Arabic, and they put their life on line for the American public.
Police officers, doctors, teachers, attorneys, parents, students, volunteers. Muslims integrate the tenets of their faith into all aspects of their lives.
When I come into work, I cannot leave my Islamicity, for lack of a better term, outside. I bring it in. I bring my values about being good to people, about being sensitive, about being caring, about being ethical. All of those values come with me. In addition, I've got to follow the traditional rituals of practice.
Muslims, just like people of all faiths, expect police officers to exhibit those same values.
I want my son to always feel that an officer is someone he can trust, he can look up to, and he can call, and not fear.
And police need to be sensitive to an increased fear among Muslims in light of current world events.
I think a lot of explanation on part of the police officer or a sense of reassuring them that this is just a routine stop will go a long way in allaying some of those concerns.
As a police officer, there are many religious and cultural considerations to keep in mind when dealing with people of the Islamic faith. The 5 daily prayers are an important part of Muslim life and are done in a prostrate position. Fridays are the holiest days for Muslims, and large crowds gather at mosques. Muslim men and women may avoid direct eye contact with members of the opposite sex, and many prefer not to shake hands. Unless there are safety or security concerns, the following considerations are recommended. Remove your shoes when entering the prayer area of a mosque. Because modesty is highly valued in Islam, if possible, Muslim men and women should be interviewed by officers of the same gender. And Muslim women should be allowed to remove their headscarves in private whenever possible. Also, keep in mind, some Muslims have an increased fear of law enforcement due to anti-Muslim sentiment following terrorist attacks by foreign Islamic extremists. All of the people we encounter on a daily basis expect to be treated with dignity and respect. Those who practice the Islam faith are no exception. It is our hope that this video will serve to enlighten and foster a new awareness and understanding. Thanks for watching, and as always, stay safe.